Before we begin, settle into your bed. Let your shoulders sink into the mattress. Let your eyelids grow heavy, as though each breath you take carries you a little deeper into the quiet. There was a library, somewhere in the old quarter of a city whose name has long since softened into memory, that stood on a quiet street where the cobblestones were worn smooth by centuries of slow footsteps. The building itself was made of pale stone, streaked with the soft green of age, its tall windows dark and reflective in the hours before dawn, catching nothing but the faint gray light of a sky not yet ready to commit to morning. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust, of leather bindings and the particular sweetness of wood polish applied by hands that had long since learned the patience such work required. The shelves rose high, impossibly high, their wooden frames dark with age, each one holding row after row of books bound in colors that had faded, over the years, into 1,000 variations of brown and burgundy and deep, quiet green. There were no electric lights here. Only the soft glow of oil lamps, placed at careful intervals along the reading tables, their flames burning low and steady, casting long shadows that moved, slow as breathing, across the high arched ceiling above. And in this library, in this quiet hour before the city outside had begun to stir, there worked a man whose name was known to no one beyond the few who had reason to visit this forgotten corner of the world. He was the archivist, the keeper of the books, the silent guardian of shelves that had stood for generations, patient as stones, waiting for hands that might one day come to turn their pages. He was not young. He was not old, exactly, though his hair had long since turned the color of the dust that settled, so softly, on the spines of the oldest volumes. He moved through the aisles with the careful, unhurried tread of a man who had learned, over many years, that there was no need to rush anywhere in a place where time itself seemed to move differently, slower, gentler, as though the library breathed its own quiet rhythm. Tonight, or this morning, for the hour between night and dawn had always been his favorite. He carried a small lamp in one hand, its flame barely flickering, and a soft cloth in the other. And he moved from shelf to shelf, dusting the spines of the books with the same careful, patient attention he brought to everything. It was a small task, a quiet task, the kind of task that required no great thought but offered, in return, the particular piece of hands occupied gently while the mind was left free to wander wherever it wished. He paused, as he often did, before a shelf of particularly old volumes, their leather bindings cracked and dry, their titles so faded they could no longer be read without the closest possible attention. He ran his fingers slowly across their spines, not reading, simply feeling, the texture of the leather, the slight give of the pages within, the particular weight of a book that had been held, perhaps, by hands that had long since turned to dust themselves. And it was here, in this quiet and familiar ritual, that he noticed something he had not noticed before. A single volume, tucked at the end of the shelf, slightly out of alignment with its neighbors, as though someone had replaced it carelessly, or perhaps in haste. He set down his cloth, adjusted the lamp's flame to burn a little brighter, and reached for the book with the same calm, deliberate care he brought to everything. The book, when he lifted it from the shelf, was lighter than he had expected. It was bound in dark leather, soft and worn smooth at the edges, as though it had been handled many times. He carried it to his desk, a heavy oak table positioned near the tall window at the far end of the reading room. and set it down with the same careful attention he gave to every book that passed through his hands. The lamp's glow fell upon its cover, revealing a faint pattern pressed into the leather, too worn to make out clearly, but suggestive, perhaps, of something like a tree or a network of roots, or the branching lines of an old and faded map. He opened it slowly, the old leather creaking softly in the quiet of the room, and found, inside, not the printed pages he had expected, but a collection of loose papers, letters, drawings, fragments of what seemed to be a diary. The first page, written in ink that had faded to a soft brown with age, began simply, "I have kept this record in the hope that someone, someday, will find it. Someone who understands that not all histories are written in the books that line the public shelves." He read the words slowly, letting each phrase settle into his mind the way dust settles, gradually and without hurry, onto the surfaces of a long unvisited room. He turned the page, and found a drawing, a sketch, in the same careful hand, of a building he did not recognize, though there was something familiar about its shape, about the tall windows and the arched entrance. Below the sketch, a single line of text, "They built it to hide what they could not destroy." He sat back in his chair, the lamp's flame flickering gently in a draught he could not feel, and let his gaze drift, for a moment, toward the tall window and the gray light of the approaching dawn beyond. The next few pages of the old volume contained a series of drawings, maps, mostly, though not of any city or region he recognized. They showed winding paths through what appeared to be forests, small circles marking what might have been villages or settlements. He studied the map for a long while, tracing the lines with his finger, the paper soft and slightly rough beneath his touch. He turned the page again, and found a letter, written in the same careful hand, addressed to no one and beginning simply, "If you are reading this, you have found what I left for you, not by chance, though it may feel that way." He read the words twice, slowly, letting them settle, and felt something shift, very slightly, in his understanding of the book he had found. The lines were not roads. They were not paths through a forest. They were the passages of a building, a large building, with a central chamber and wings radiating outward. And the central chamber, the large circle at the heart of it all, was marked with a single word, written in the same careful hand. "Here." He sat with the book open before him for a long while, the lamp's flame burning low and steady, the gray light outside the window gradually brightening toward the pale gold of a winter morning. He closed the book, carefully, and set it aside on his desk, next to the cloth he had been using to dust the shelves. He would not, he decided, attempt to follow the map immediately. There would be time for that. There was always time, in a library this old, for the slow unfolding of whatever had been set in motion. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked slowly through the familiar aisles, past the tall shelves of dark wood, past the reading tables with their low-burning lamps. He paused, as he often did, at the window that overlooked the small garden at the back of the library, a garden he had tended, in his own quiet way, for many years, though it had long since grown wild with neglect. He looked out at the garden, and he thought of the map, and the radiating lines, and the word written at the center of it all, "Here." He did not know what the map was leading him toward, or why it had been hidden in a book without a title, on a shelf where it did not quite belong. The archivist did not leave the library that morning. He had work to do, the ordinary, unhurried work that filled each of his days, a new acquisition to catalog, a broken binding to repair. He moved through these tasks with his usual calm, patient attention. But the book remained at the edge of his awareness, a quiet presence on his desk, waiting, patient as he was, for the moment when he would return to it. It was not until the afternoon, when the pale winter sun had begun to slant low through the tall windows and the shadows in the reading room had grown long and soft, that he allowed himself to open the book again. He turned to the map once more, studying the radiating lines with the same careful attention he had brought to every other detail, and he began, slowly, to compare what he saw there with what he knew of the city around him. The library stood on a quiet street in the old quarter, but it was not the only old building in the neighborhood. There were others, a church, its spire visible from the library's upper windows, a row of townhouses that had once belonged to merchants and scholars. Each of these buildings, he realized, as he traced the lines on the map, corresponded, in some approximate way, to the radiating lines that spread outward from the central circle. And the central circle itself, the word, here, was marked at a point that seemed to lie, if his calculations were correct, directly beneath the library itself. He sat back, the lamp's flame flickering gently, and let the thought settle into his mind the way dust settles, gradually and without hurry, onto the pages of a book left open too long on a desk. The map was not a map of some distant place, some forgotten forest or abandoned village. It was a map of the building he was sitting in, the library itself, with its central reading room and its wings and its old garden at the back. He closed the book once more, carefully, and rose from his chair. The library was quiet, as it always was in the late afternoon, the last of the day's visitors having long since departed. He walked slowly toward the door that led to the back garden, a door he had passed 1,000 times, a door he had opened 1,000 times, always for the same purpose, to step out into the small, overgrown space and breathe the cool air. But this time, when he stepped through the door and out into the garden, he looked at it differently. He looked at the overgrown paths, nearly hidden beneath years of accumulated leaves and moss, and he saw, for the first time, that they were not random. They followed a pattern that matched, in its broad outline, the radiating lines on the map he had found. He walked slowly along the nearest path, brushing aside the overhanging branches of an old shrub that had grown nearly to the height of his shoulder, and he came, after only a few paces, to a place where the ground seemed to dip slightly. He knelt, the damp grass cold against his knees, and brushed away the leaves and moss to reveal a stone, flat and dark, set into the ground, with something carved into its surface. He traced the carving with his finger, clearing away the last of the dirt, and found, beneath the grime of many years, a single word, worn but still legible. Here. He had walked over that stone 1,000 times. He had stood in this garden, had breathed its quiet air, had let his thoughts drift, and never once had he noticed the faint indentation in the ground. He looked down at the stone for a long while, the afternoon light slanting through the bare branches of the old trees that surrounded the garden, and he thought about the map, and the book, and the careful hands that had placed it on the shelf, slightly out of alignment. He reached down, his fingers finding the edges of the stone, and he pushed, gently at first, then with more pressure, and felt, beneath his hands, a slight give, as though the stone were not fixed to the earth but set upon something, a hinge, perhaps. He pushed again, and the stone shifted, just slightly, revealing a dark opening beneath, and a set of stone steps descending into what appeared to be a narrow passage, its walls lined with the same pale stone as the library above. He paused, there at the edge of the opening, and considered. He had not expected to find anything more than a quiet mystery, a small puzzle to occupy his idle hours, a diversion from the slow, familiar rhythm of his days. He took a breath, slow and steady, and began his descent. The steps were narrow and worn, their edges softened by time, and he moved down them slowly, one careful foot at a time, the lamp he had brought casting long shadows against the damp stone walls. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint, mineral smell of earth and stone, and the only sound was the soft echo of his own footsteps, measured and unhurried. The passage was not long, perhaps a dozen steps, perhaps a few more, and at its bottom, it opened into a small chamber, round and low-ceilinged, with a single stone bench set against the far wall. The walls were covered in carvings, the same branching, root-like patterns he had seen on the map, the same lines that had drawn him from the library to the garden and from the garden to this hidden place. He set his lamp on the bench and let its light fall across the carvings, studying them with the same careful attention he had brought to every other detail. They were not merely decorative, they told a story, if only he could read it correctly. Figures moved through the carvings, men and women in the dress of another century, carrying books and scrolls. He traced the lines of the carvings with his finger, following the path of the figures, and he saw, at the center of the story, a small, detailed image of a book that looked, in its shape and binding, very much like the one he had found on the shelf. He sat down on the bench, the stone cool against his back, and let the quiet of the chamber settle around him. There was no urgency here, no need to rush toward whatever conclusion this mystery might hold. There was only the slow, patient turning of the story, unfolding at exactly the pace it needed to unfold. He did not know how long he sat there, in the cool quiet of the chamber, the lamp's flame burning low and steady, the carvings on the walls catching the light in soft, shifting patterns. When he finally rose, his limbs stiff from sitting, he moved toward the far wall of the chamber, where the carvings seemed to gather into a single, focused image, a door set into the stone. He reached out, his fingers finding the edge of the carved outline, and he pushed, gently, and felt the stone give way, slowly and reluctantly, the way the stone above had given way when he had first opened the passage into this hidden place. The door swung open, not onto another chamber, but onto a small room, a room no larger than his own desk at the library, its walls lined with shelves, each shelf holding a single book, each book bound in the same dark leather, each book bearing no title on its spine. And at the center of the room, on a small wooden table, lay a single volume, open to a page covered in the same careful, fine handwriting he had come to recognize. He stepped into the room, the lamp held high, and he read the words that lay open before him. "If you have found this room, you have followed the path I laid for you." He read the words slowly, letting them settle, and then he looked at the books on the shelves, the dark leather bindings, the untitled spines, and he understood, with a clarity that came slowly, that he had discovered something far larger than he had ever imagined. Not merely a mystery, not merely a puzzle to be solved, but a collection, a library within a library, of histories that had been hidden, carefully and deliberately, by hands that had trusted, across generations, that someone, somewhere, would be patient enough to find them. He sat at the small table, the open book before him, the lamp's flame casting its low, steady light across the page, and he read. Not quickly, not urgently, but slowly, the way he read everything. The story the book told was not a story of danger or fear, not a tale of dark conspiracies or terrible secrets. It was a story of keeping, of tending, of preserving, of holding safe the things that mattered most. He read until the lamp's flame began to flicker low, and he closed the book gently, and he looked at the shelves around him, at the dark leather bindings and the untitled spines, at the quiet, patient accumulation of so many years of careful keeping. He rose slowly, and he walked to the nearest shelf, and he reached out, his fingers finding the spine of one of the untitled volumes, and he drew it down, careful as always. He opened it, not to read, not yet, but simply to feel its weight, to smell its old paper, to hold in his hands the work of someone who had trusted, across the long distance of years, that someone would come, eventually, to find what had been left for them. He returned the book to its place and stood for a long while in the quiet of the room, the lamp's flame burning low, the dark shelves around him holding the accumulated weight of so many stories, so many lives. And he understood, in that quiet moment, that he had become part of that chain, that he, too, was now a keeper, a guardian, one of the quiet ones who tended the hidden shelves. He made his way back through the passage slowly, the lamp held high, his footsteps echoing softly against the damp stone walls. The air grew warmer as he climbed, the cool mineral smell of the underground giving way to the familiar sense of the library above, old paper, wood polish, the faint sweetness of the winter air. He paused at the top of the steps, the stone door still open behind him, and looked out at the garden, its overgrown paths now touched by the deep blue light of early evening. He closed the stone door gently, carefully, the way one closes a book that has been read slowly and with great attention. He knelt for a moment, his fingers brushing the moss and leaves back into place, covering the stone until it was once again invisible, a secret held by the earth itself. Then he rose and walked back through the garden, past the overgrown paths and the dry fountain and the ivy-covered walls. He entered the library through the familiar door, and he crossed the reading room, past the tall shelves and the dark tables and the low-burning lamps, until he reached his desk. He sat down slowly, the way he always sat down at the end of a long day, and he let his gaze drift toward the tall windows, where the evening sky had deepened into a rich, dark blue. He did not return to the hidden room that night. There would be time for that, he knew. Time to read the other books, to learn the other stories, to understand the full shape of what had been entrusted to his keeping. There was no need to rush. The books had waited for years, for decades, perhaps for centuries, and they would wait a little longer, patient as stones, patient as the library itself. He settled into his usual evening routine, the low lamp on his desk, the soft cloth in his hand, the slow, careful dusting of the nearest shelf. He moved through the familiar aisles, the familiar books, the familiar quiet that had been the background of his life for so many years, and he felt, in the steady rhythm of his work, a deep and lasting peace. He paused at the shelf where he had found the book without a title, and he ran his fingers lightly across the other volumes, the ones that had waited beside it. He worked until the lamp's flame burned low and the library had settled into its deepest quiet, the kind of quiet that comes only in the hours between midnight and dawn. Then he set down his cloth and closed his eyes and let himself, for a moment, simply rest. He thought, in that quiet hour, of the hidden room beneath the garden, and the books on its shelves, and the chain of keepers who had held them safe across the years. He thought of the library itself, the tall shelves, the dark tables, the low-burning lamps, the quiet that had been the background of his life for so many years, and he felt, in that thought, a deep and lasting gratitude. He opened his eyes and looked out at the tall windows, where the stars had grown brighter in the deep dark of the sky, and he smiled, a small and quiet smile. He would sleep tonight, deeply, peacefully, the way one sleeps when one's work is done and one's heart is at rest. The first light of morning found him still at his desk, though he had slept a little, resting his head on his folded arms in the way he sometimes did when the night had been long. He opened his eyes slowly, the pale gray light filtering through the tall windows, and he looked at the book on his desk, the untitled volume, the map, the letters, the story that had led him, step by careful step, into the hidden room beneath the garden. He rose, stretching slowly, and walked to the window that overlooked the garden. The morning light was soft and gray, the kind of light that seems to hold the whole world in a gentle, patient pause. The garden was still overgrown, its paths still hidden beneath leaves and moss, but he saw it differently now, not as a place that had been neglected, but as a place that had been waiting. He would begin, he decided, to tend the garden properly, to clear the paths, to restore the fountain, to let the light fall where it had not fallen in many years. He turned from the window, and he looked at the book on his desk, and he knew, with the quiet certainty that came from many years of patient, careful work, that the story was not finished. He made his tea, as he did every morning, and he opened the library's doors, as he did every morning, and he settled into his desk, as he did every morning, and he began, once more, the quiet, patient work of keeping. If you are still with me, dear listener, you have likely drifted somewhere between waking and sleep by now, and that is exactly where this final part of the story wants to carry you. Picture the archivist, if you will, settled once more in his familiar chair at the library's tall window, the book without a title resting beside him on the desk. Picture the hidden room beneath the stones, its shelves of untitled volumes, its small wooden table, its lamp burning low and steady in the quiet dark. Picture the city beyond the library walls, settling gradually into its own quiet rhythm, the cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of slow footsteps. And picture yourself, dear listener, as part of that same quiet rhythm, your breathing slow and even, your body resting soft and warm wherever you are. There is no need to remember every detail of what has been told here tonight. The book on the shelf, the map in its pages, the door in the garden, the hidden room beneath the stones. What matters now is only this: that you are safe, that you are warm, that the world outside your window, wherever you are, holds nothing more threatening than its own soft and silent drift. Let your thoughts, if they wander, wander gently, perhaps toward the tall shelves of the library, dark and quiet, holding their patient accumulation of stories. The fog will still be there in the morning, soft and gray and familiar, curling gently around the windows of the old library. Sleep well, dear listener. The library will still be there in the morning. But for now, there is only the quiet, and the rest, and the deep, patient peace of a night spent among the hidden shelves. Good night, dear listener. Good night, quiet archivist. Good night, forgotten library, and all the patient stories sleeping soundly within your ancient and well-loved walls.